Welcome back to the Empowering America podcast, the podcast that focuses on energy, naturally, brought to you by the Empowerment Alliance. In the fight to ensure America's access to clean, affordable, reliable, and abundant natural gas, we speak with the biggest players in energy every week. Join us as we interview the heroes who are continuing the natural gas revolution and continue fighting back against the Green New Deal and other green at any cost policies that unnecessarily inject risk into our country's energy security. Now your host, Executive Director of the Empowerment Alliance, Matt Hammond.
Today I'm joined by renowned author and speaker Robert Bryce. And Robert, thank you so much for joining us today on our show.
Glad to be with you, Matt. I don't know what we're going to talk about, though. There's nothing happening in the energy business, so it's been kind of quiet lately. So I don't know. It's been, can we fill whatever time is? I don't know. It's been kind of boring. I don't know what you're seeing, Hammond, but it's been kind of quiet.
I think one question and we could fill up the whole 30 minutes. And I was just going to say there's so much going on in the energy space right now with prices being what they are, policies being what they are. You and I had the opportunity to talk on the phone for 20, 30 minutes a few months ago, and it was just one issue after another. But where I want to start with you, if we can, I don't want to focus immediately on the issues that we have, but I'm fascinated by your documentary Juice that you made in 2020. And it really focuses on how other countries don't have access to electricity, energy poverty in underdeveloped countries. And I'm really interested to hear about what that experience was like for you and what you learned from it.
Sure. Well, what I learned from it, man, how much it was a real eye opener. And I guess I'll answer one question you didn't ask, which was what surprised me the most, or what was the part of the production of the film that was the one that still sits with me. And it's the level of poverty in the developing countries and in India. And I'm not an expert on India. I've only been there once, but to see the abject poverty in which so many people are living in the world today, it's still jarring to think about it. It wasn't the same level of poverty in Puerto Rico or in Lebanon, but those were equally impactful in that seeing how desperate people can be to get the electricity they need. And it led me to formulate one idea, which is that the iron law of electricity, which is people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And that was one of the key things that I came away from that film with, was that people aren't going to be sitting in the dark. They just will not agree to be, energy poor. They will do whatever they have to do. They'll steal electricity. They'll buy their own generator. They'll pay the generator mafia, which was what we saw in Beirut. But that was the part that to me was so clear and still resonates with me now, is that humans aren't, we're once we get a little energy, we want more. And when we get a little more, we want a little more. And we want better and cleaner forms of energy continually. And the more we use, the more we want. And that's part of who we are. And so that part of it. And just one other point about the film. I didn't plan to make a documentary. That wasn't part of what I thought about. I got a contract for, my sixth book, Question of Power, in 2016. And I thought, I'm doing a book about electricity. I should just do a film too. How hard can that be? Well, it was a lot harder than I expected, but I got them both done. And so now that it's 2 years ago, I've forgotten. It's like childbirth. You forget about how hard it is. And I'm, crazy enough to do another documentary. So I'm working on another one, but yeah, I'm proud of that film, and I'm pleased that you liked it. It's been well received.
Yeah, it was great. And I think it's such an issue that, to me, as Americans who grow up in a society that electricity is not an issue, how we can take things for granted.
Oh yeah.
And that was the one thing that was one takeaway that I had from the film. So let's get into that a little bit then on what the U.S. has. And this is going to go into the issues that we have today. Right now, the United States has about 100-year supply of natural gas, right? but yet our policies seem to moving us backwards and trying to force the marketplace to pick winners and losers. Prices are through the roof. Natural gas is really high. Price at the pump, everybody knows, is really high. As a country, why are we moving in this direction? Well, how did we get from where we were a year and a half ago to where we are today?
Sure. Well, first I'll preface it by saying I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm disgusted. And I am disgusted. But I think the Biden administration is they're just anti-hydrocarbons. I mean, and they have, as a friend of mine said, or a distant cousin some time ago, she married a guy, they live in Washington, and they said about the Biden crowd, they have lots of tactics, but no strategy. I mean, they don't have a strategy for making energy cheap, abundant, and reliable. What they have a strategy for is to promote a lot of things that won't work. And so they promote clean energy. Well, what is that? Solar and wind? And well, where are you going to put it? How are you going to site it? What is, but none of those questions are answered or addressed. So I think that, this is a lot of just a mismatch between the hard physics and math of energy and power systems colliding with a lot of ideologically driven ideas about energy and power that have no connection to the physical world. And that's where I live. I mean, I spend a lot of time in rural America talking to people, rural Americans, farmers. They live in the physical world, and this need for gasoline, for liquid fuels, for coal, for oil and gas, all of these things, and the staggering scale of our consumption, it doesn't translate easily to these policymakers who have no experience or understanding of what the business is about, and nor any idea about what it means in the physical world, not seeing with power plants, seeing refineries. And so I think it's not just a cultural divide. And I think there is that, right? It's the urban-rural divide. It's the Democratic left-right divide, but it's also a divide in terms of life experience and understanding of these basic things that are essential to our livelihoods, and that we're dealing with a lot of policymakers who just have no understanding of what the actual business of producing electrons and molecules is about.
Well, and two, if the price of gasoline is too high, Robert, what do? Go buy an electric vehicle, right? Well, and that is policy solution.
Yeah, but what we've seen, and what's remarkable, is that the very inelastic demand for these liquid fuels, that there is no replacement for them. And so we're seeing these massive increases in prices because people still have to drive. They have to, they want to take their kids on vacation. They got to get to work and back, and they've got to go to the grocery store. So people aren't driving necessarily less despite these big increases in prices. So again, a mismatch between this rhetoric of, we'll let everyone drive an electric car. Okay, well, so here's a fact. It's not a little fact. It's a fact. The average household income the median household income for an electric vehicle buyer is twice that of the national average. The national average household income in the U.S. is about $65,000. Average household income for an EV buyer is $140,000. So this idea that, bricklayers and carpenters and janitors and, baristas are going to be driving Teslas, come on. I mean, it's just not, again, a cultural mismatch between the policymakers in Washington and the reality of the working class and middle class in America.
Right. No, completely agree with that. Well, and, we talked a little bit about, electric vehicles, and let's get into renewables as well. There was a big push, as you've talked about, for renewable energy, wind, solar, but you've actually, and I really want to get into this with you, talked about how local governments are not approving these projects. And oftentimes they are in blue states that push for renewable energy policy, but the local governments aren't going to approve them. So there's clearly a disconnect between what maybe a governor or Washington, D.C. says versus what local governments believe. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first, Matt, I'd point you to the Renewable Rejection Database, which is a database that I've been compiling now since 2015 on my own time, on my own dime. It's available on my website, robertbryce.com. Over the last 8 years, I've cataloged and have documented 330 rejections of the wind energy business from Maine to Hawaii. And in not in every state, but in many states across the country, local governments, counties, towns, some cases court cases, in some cases federal entities, but nevertheless, 330 times since 2015, wind projects have been rejected or restricted in the United States. And why is this happening? It's because local governments, local landowners, rural Americans are saying we don't want 500 and 600 foot high wind turbines in our neighborhoods. And, they get derided. Oh, these are just NIMBYs. I hate that term. Agreed. Everyone everywhere cares about what happens in their neighborhoods, and damn well they should. And why are these people pushing back? Because they don't want these 500, 600 foot high wind turbines. They don't want the visual pollution. They don't want the visual blight. They want to preserve their landscapes. And they're rightly concerned about the noise pollution from these monster machines. The noise pollution from these machines is real. It hurts human health. It annoys people. It disturbs their sleep. These are serious concerns. But you won't read about it. You will not read about it, Matt, in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and you sure won't see it in National Public Radio. I mean, I've been a journalist my whole career. I've never had a real job, but I used to think the liberal media was a fiction. No, it's real. And they, even though, and you mentioned blue states, you can't build wind in California, onshore wind, and they're saying they're going to build offshore. I don't think that's going to happen either. No. You can't build wind projects in New York. In fact, in New York, it's so unpopular that bureaucrats in Albany have passed measures that will allow bureaucrats in Albany to override local zoning and force communities to take wind projects they don't want. And the same thing is true in Vermont. You can't build wind projects in Vermont. So 3 of the most heavily Democratic states in America with populations that are adamantly pro, renewables, but build it somewhere else, out there in flyover country, but the last rejection happened on May 5th in Crawford County, Ohio. I mean, here's a town or county that said, we don't want your stinking turbines. Go take them somewhere and put them where the wind doesn't blow.
Yeah, the state of Ohio just passed a law that gave local entities or local citizens the right to vote via referendum on a project because people were so up in arms about them. And if your county wants them, great.
SB 52. Yeah,
that's right. That's right.
And what's remarkable about SB 52, signed into law by Governor DeWine in August, I think, of 2021. That law passed the Ohio legislature, and not a single Democratic House or Senate member in the Ohio legislature voted for it. Yeah, not one. So this is indicative of, to me, again, as a nonpartisan, well, it's clear that this issue is partisan, but this is part of the urban-rural divide, that, renewables are very popular among liberals who live in cities and Democrats who live in cities and urban areas. And they think, oh, well, sure, I want to put those renewables, out there in Bixby, Oklahoma, or, Crawford County or Cherokee County or Reno County, Kansas. Well, Cherokee and Reno County, Kansas have both passed restrictions on wind projects in Kansas. And these rural battles against big business are happening all across the country. But it's clear in Ohio. You have this very clear divide between urban voters who want the idea of renewables and big wind turbines and solar panels, but they're not the ones who have to live next to them.
Right. Agreed. So, Robert, you have a couple books. You have the documentary. You have got your own podcast. I'll give you a little time. Talk a little bit about those things.
Sure. Well, I've written 6 books. My first book was on Enron called Pipe Dreams, came out 20 years ago, in fact, which is hard to believe. And in fact, I'm still writing about Enron and Enron related ideas today. But since then, I've written, 5 other books. My latest one is A Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations, which I'm very proud of. Came out 2 years ago, about the same time that the film came out. So I'm proud of all those books. So, all the people listening, remember, you don't have to read these books. You just have to buy them. Tell everyone you don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. And if you buy it on your Kindle, I make a better royalty. My film, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, which I made with my colleague Tyson Culver. He directed it and did just a great job. It's available on all the major streaming platforms. You can watch it on Roku channel for free, in fact. So by all means, check it out. It's the best film on electricity you'll ever see. Not bragging, just fact.
I loved it. I thought it was great. Really good.
Thank you. And then my podcast, the Power Hungry Podcast, you can see the TV screen behind me. I'm having great fun with that. Did an interview just recently with Alex Epstein talking about his new book, Fossil Future. Interviewed Ian Bremmer on his new book, The Power of Crisis, which is around here somewhere. Having authors on, people. My hurdle for the podcast is just, is this person someone I think is interesting? And so that's what I've been doing is just, I like talking to people. I'm like my dad that way. I just, I like people and I like hearing about their stories. And so the podcast is on all the major podcast channels and on my YouTube channel, Robert Bryce TV. So you can check it out there.
Yeah. When I came to T and they told me I was going to be hosting a podcast, I thought, I don't want to host a podcast. And then I started hosting a podcast and I thought, this is cool. I like it. Like talking, engaging with people.
It's interesting, just having a conversation and then letting other people listen in. And, it takes a lot of preparation, a lot of time, but I find it deeply gratifying. I really enjoy the process and the learning of it.
Yeah, agreed. So we've talked a little bit about the renewable side of things in terms of local government and concerns that residents have. But the affordability, Robert, everybody is worried about affordability. We were out in the field looking for data and polling people. And before Russia invaded Ukraine, 74% of Americans cared about the affordability of energy. That number is going to be significantly higher today, I got to imagine. So again, with the whole push towards renewable, what impact is that forced transition going to have on a consumer's wallet?
Well, let's put that question aside for just a minute, Matt, because in some ways I think it doesn't matter. And I'm not saying not being combative here, but that after February 24th, we've seen a change in the energy landscape completely, right? When Putin invaded and the Russian army invaded Ukraine, it fundamentally changed the energy balance around the world. And we're dealing with the consequences of that now with $6, $7 diesel fuel, $4, $5 gasoline. These aren't all, by the way, now it's wrong, 100% wrong to blame this all on Putin and Russia, because a lot of these inflationary pressures in the energy markets were already in place before February 24th. Agreed. By some calculations, as much as 80% of them. So It's not just about that, about Russia, Ukraine. It involves a lot of issues around the drilling industry and why, they wasted, not wasted, they burned up about $300 billion in cash to make oil and gas cheaper in the U.S. and consumers benefited enormously from that, while the oil and gas companies, a lot of them just went bankrupt and a lot of money was just burned through. But this is the key point. Expensive energy is the enemy of the poor. Full stop. Expensive energy is the enemy of the poor and the working class. Now, there are a lot of elites who say, oh, well, and I remember very distinctly a guy I know said, oh, well, energy is too cheap. And I just thought, okay, I think I'm done here because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what energy is. We humans want it and we need energy. And that is the basis of a prosperity. So this idea that we should make energy expensive is dangerous and so completely wrong-headed. I can't even hardly speak to it. But that's what we're seeing now is the energy price inflation across the board. And what is clear is this effort to try and force us to move to weather-dependent renewables will make this problem so much worse. And we don't have to look far to see the consequences. We can look at Germany. We can look at California as the two obvious examples and very clear examples of provinces that have pushed the decarbonization efforts too far, too fast, and consumers are taking it in the shorts. Electricity prices in California have increased at 5 times the rate of the rest of the states in the lower 48 since 2008. At 5x the rate. So Californians are now paying some of the highest electricity prices in America. And why? Because they pushed this renewable mirage, this renewable fiction too far, too fast. And that's what, unfortunately, the Biden administration is hoping to do for across the country with the full support of I'm going to call them out, Sierra Club, Natural Resource Defense Council, Environmental Defense Fund, all these NGO groups, NGO industrial complex, this is what they want. And they're pushing this relentlessly with no regard for the poor and the middle class and no regard for the prices.
And it's the same people, the middle to lower income families that side of the aisle claims to represent, right? But their policies don't reflect that.
Which is the part that just sticks in my craw. It just sticks in my craw. I mean, who are these people?
And it's so upside down from a policy standpoint and what we as a country should be looking for. And you talk about Germany, and this is something that has really piqued our interest. I mean, the European Union has realized that they have gone the absolute wrong direction to where they at least put a vote on the table that natural gas can be considered a green, sustainable source of energy.
Sure.
If the European Union can do that, then this country needs to open their eyes and look at different opportunities on how we think about energy policy for consumers.
Well, and I tend to agree. I just think that, what we're seeing now is the lagging effects of a lot of underinvestment in the upstream in drill bit hydrocarbons and frankly, an administration that has made it clear that they're hostile to the oil and gas industry. I mean, they made that over and over. And I've double checked this. I've heard it, but I double checked it with the people at TransCanada, is now known as TC Energy. When Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, not only did they cancel the pipeline, they went to the Canadian border and dug out the section of pipe that actually crosses the boundary line. So they wanted to make sure that not only are we canceling the pipe, we're going to remove the pipeline that makes the transfer of oil from the oil sands in Canada into the U.S. impossible without crossing that boundary line again. So I mean, this is the kind of level of hostility to the oil and gas industry that is evident in this administration. It's deeply unfortunate, particularly now when it's clear that we're in the midst of a global energy crisis. Look at the price. I mean, we talked about oil and gas. The price of coal in Newcastle, the Australian benchmark price out of the port at Newcastle in Australia is now over $400 a ton. 16 months ago, it was at $100 a ton. So this idea that, we're going to quit burning coal or we're going to go beyond coal, which is what the Sierra Club is pushing with the backing of Michael Bloomberg. No, we're not. Where the hell we are. Last year, coal consumption in the U.S. went up 17%. Utilities in the U.S. are looking for as much coal as they can find. We can't get any more because the mines are complete at maximum capacity. So it's not just oil and gas. It's across every form of hydrocarbons.
Yeah, no, completely agree with that. And that's a point that I think is very, very well made. And I think too, when you look at what the United States can do on the global marketplace to increase LNG exports, right? To help European countries like, Germany or whomever to get off of Russian gas is such a critical point that we as a country should be making a policy decision on to ramp up, to reduce regulations, make it safe, make sure it's safe, but do it efficiently can be a huge boost to the global marketplace.
Well, yes, that's true. I will say, though, and I think I'm compelled to say, I'm not opposed to having our hydrocarbons go into the European market. But the more we send LNG overseas, that's making the U.S. price of gas come up closer to the level of what we see in Europe. And I understand why it's happening. It's just that the globalization of the commodity. I mean, we've always had a global market really for oil, right? Whether we're pricing at a WTI, West Texas Intermediate, or the Brent marker, oil has long been traded in the international market. And now what we're seeing is natural gas being traded much more as an international commodity. And one of the effects of that and the use of and the dramatic increase in LNG exports from the U.S., the U.S. is now the biggest LNG exporter in the world, is that U.S. natural gas prices are rising, not to the level of where they are in Europe at, over $30 last time I checked per million BTUs, but they're bringing up that price. And so that's good for the world. But for, let's be clear, not overly great for the U.S. consumer, because now some of those same molecules are being marketed overseas. And I understand why. And I understand why we need to do it, and particularly to support Europe in the wake of this invasion. But there's some effects of this that are clearly have to be noted.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I have to ask you about this because, and we'll wrap up after this. In a speech you gave in 2015 at the Shale Insight Conference, you made a comment that the United States out OPEC'd OPEC, which I loved. I thought it was very well said. But now, again, kind of back to the same theme. The U.S. is pulling from strategic reserves. We're going to OPEC producing nations and asking them to produce more oil and open up supply chains. And you and I talked about this when we were on the phone a few months ago. Why? Why are we doing this?
Yeah. I mean, isn't it remarkable that you see the Biden administration had gone to Venezuela, right, to ask Maduro, who's a narco. He's a narco trafficker. If they, can you produce more oil? And I'm thinking, what the hell? And last fall, they were asking the Saudis the same thing. I testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee. I'm not bragging here, but I did last November. And I was in Washington, and I was in the hearing room in the Dirksen Senate building. And it was Senator Murkowski from Alaska asked me about this. She said, if you notice that we're asking the Saudis to produce more oil. And I said, yeah, I thought I saw that headline and I thought I was reading The Onion. I really did. I thought this is a joke. I mean, you're going to go and ask the Venezuelans, the narco, who's now the head of, nominally the dictator of Venezuela, a country that he and the Chavistas have run straight into the ditch and destroyed PDVSA, the national oil company. Now, Biden this week, I think, is in Saudi Arabia, and he's going to ask Mohammed bin Salman for, to produce more oil. The same guy who was involved or implicated in the murder of Khashoggi in Turkey. What are we doing here? And at the same time that we're not allowing more drilling on federal lands in the United States. I mean, this doesn't make any sense, Matt. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all, except if you view it through the lens of a very long, decades-long hostility to the oil and gas industry by these NGOs in the United States. I don't call them environmental groups. They're not green groups. They're just activist groups. That they're just hostile to the U.S. oil and gas industry because that's how they raise money. I think it's just that simple.
And it's at the expense of the American consumer at the end of the day, which is a shame.
Absolutely. And I think about it this way, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's just that, tradespeople that I know and respect, and people that I respect because they're so incredibly hardworking, and I'm blessed in my life. I work hard, but I'm not like, some of the folks I know, and they drive a lot. And so every dollar or every dime of increase in the price of gasoline, the price of motor fuel hurts them. It doesn't do anything for them. This idea, energy's too cheap. Well, you could say that if you're rich. But for people who are just getting by, people who are, living paycheck to paycheck, every little increment of increase in cost in motor fuel or natural gas or electricity hurts them. It doesn't help them in any way. And so I find these issues to be, they're incredibly important, but the affordability, resilience, reliability are the ones that I focus on. And they're the ones that I think are the winning issues because they go across the spectrum, the political spectrum. Affordability of energy should be a bipartisan issue. And I think the Democrats are completely on the wrong side of this. And I think we're going to get spanked in November because they don't understand this from a voter's viewpoint. Instead, they're seeing it through this lens of, frankly, a lot of elitists on the coast who, think that this is, that we only have one way forward and it doesn't involve hydrocarbons, but they just don't understand the nature of the business.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And you mentioned paycheck to paycheck. About 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and lower
78%. Is that I haven't heard that number. That's interesting.
Yeah, lower middle income families have choices to make. They either have to fill up their car, right, to go to work, or they have to cut back on prescriptions, for example. I mean, those are real life choices that people have to make when energy prices go as high as they are right now. And it's a real shame that we're in this spot. But Robert, hey, listen, I enjoyed the conversation. As always, I really appreciate your time. Again, check out Robert's website, his podcast.
RobertBryce.com is my website. The podcast is the Power Hungry Podcast, and the movie is Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. It's juicethemovie.com.
Yeah, check it out. The documentary was great, and this does conclude our podcast. Please remember to subscribe to the Empowering America podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and be sure to tune into the next episode. Robert, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Matt. Good luck to you.
Thank you. You too.